Thanks for tuning in to this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. By the winter of 1864, the American Civil War was in its final grinding phase. The Confederacy, once confident in its defiance, was collapsing under the relentless pressure of Union forces. The industrial power of the North had outproduced, outmaneuvered, and outlasted the South. In Virginia, Ulysses S. Grant had locked Robert E. Lee in a brutal siege at Petersburg, steadily bleeding the Army of Northern Virginia into extinction. In Georgia, William Tecumseh Sherman had reduced the South's economic heartland to ashes, carving a path of destruction that left no illusions about the war's inevitable conclusion. But one crucial artery remained open, one last connection between the Confederacy and the outside world. For years, the Southern war machine had relied on a single remaining lifeline, its last major Atlantic port. Through it came the weapons, the ammunition, the food, and the supplies that sustained an army now fighting on borrowed time. And though the Union blockade had choked off most of the southern coast, this port had remained a rare and a vital breach in the northern stranglehold. As long as it stood, the Confederacy, bludgeoned but unbroken, could continue the fight. If it fell, the last hope of Southern resistance would die with it. The battle that followed was one of sheer will, a contest of endurance and force between men who knew exactly what was at stake. The outcome would shape the final months of the Civil War, dictate the speed of its end, and redefine the future of the United States. Its consequences would stretch far beyond the battlefield, sealing the fate of a divided nation and determining the course of American history. What happened here was more than a clash of arms. It was the last great struggle to decide whether the South could hold on, whether the Union could finally drive the stake through its rebellion, and whether the war that had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives would end in fire or drag on into something even worse. Let's now experience the Siege of Fort Fisher.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 19, The Siege of Fort Fisher, from the 23rd of December, 1864, to the 15th of January, 1865. Union Naval Force, 57 vessels. Union Land Forces, 8,000 infantry. Confederate Forces, 2,000 infantry. The fall of Fort Fisher sealed Wilmington's fate, shutting down the last open port of the Confederacy and severing its final link to the outside world. No more weapons, no more supplies, no more war material smuggled through the blockade. With that final door slammed shut, the Confederacy was left to starve, fight, and die alone.
In April of 1861, the American Civil War ignited, and the Confederacy found itself staring down a brutal reality. Outmatched, outgunned, and outproduced in every facet of war. The North held the factories, the shipyards, the weapons, and the manpower. The South had but one bargaining chip: cotton. If the Confederacy were to stand a chance, it would have to trade that cotton for foreign weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The odds were bleak, but desperate men have overturned empires with far less. That plan, however, carried its own set of challenges. While the Confederate Army swelled with battle-hardened officers who had resigned from the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy remained nearly intact. The North retained its ships, its seasoned sailors, and its iron grip on the seas. The South had almost nothing that could float, let alone contest a naval blockade. Abraham Lincoln wasted no time. Within weeks, Union warships spread along the southern coastline, sealing off the Confederacy from the outside world. No trade, no weapons, and no hope, unless blockade runners could slip through the iron net surrounding the South. At the helm of Union strategy stood Major General Winfield Scott, a man too old for the field but still sharp enough to craft a war plan that would suffocate the Confederacy. The North would strangle its enemy, cutting off trade, resources, and reinforcements. It was war by slow constriction, inescapable, merciless, and final. The first blow came fast. Lincoln's blockade slammed shut every southern harbor. Cotton rotted in warehouses. Foreign buyers turned away. desperate Confederate agents scrambled to Europe, begging for aid. But diplomacy moves even slower than war. So the Confederacy turned to speed. In English shipyards, sleek blockade runners were built, fast, low to the water, made for slipping past Union warships under the cover of darkness. Some made it through carrying precious weapons and supplies, but far too often, they brought luxury goods instead: silk, perfume, and trinkets for the Southern elite, while soldiers in the field bled out for lack of rifles and boots. The Union tightened its grip. It wasn't enough to wait at sea. They would take the ports themselves. City by city, harbor by harbor, they seized the Confederate coastline. And at the very end of that long, bitter campaign stood the last great stronghold, Wilmington, North Carolina. Some fortresses refused to fall easily, and Wilmington was one of them. 20 miles up the Cape Fear River, its lifeline was guarded by a beast, Fort Fisher. This was no ordinary fort. It was a fortress of raw earth and timber, a behemoth of walls 9 feet high and 25 feet thick, bristling with 47 heavy guns. Every ship that approached the Cape Fear would be raked by devastating fire, and any army foolish enough to attack from the land would be torn apart before it even reached the walls. In December of 1864, Sherman took Savannah, leaving behind nothing but ashes. His army wheeled north, heading to reinforce Ulysses S. Grant, who had locked the Confederacy's last great army in a brutal siege at Petersburg. But Grant had one more task before Sherman arrived: take Wilmington. For that, Fort Fisher had to die. Grant knew what Wilmington meant: a supply hub for Sherman, a strategic dagger at the Confederacy's throat, a fallback position if Carolina's defenders fought harder than expected. If Wilmington remained in Southern hands, the war would drag on. If it fell, the end would come that much faster. Grant wasted no time. He sent one of the Navy's best, Admiral David Porter, to clear a path for the Union Army. The mission was simple in words, brutal in execution: smash Fort Fisher, take Wilmington, and choke the last breath from the Confederacy. The Union force for the job was the Army of the James. At its head, General Benjamin Butler, a politician in uniform, a man who saw war not just as battle, but as opportunity. He wanted a quick, glorious victory. Instead, he would face humiliation. As a politician, Butler assumed Fort Fisher was weakly defended. He wanted a quick victory, a headline-making triumph that would propel his career forward. He didn't bother to truly study the enemy he was about to face. He devised a grand spectacle: a ship packed to the brim with 215 tons of gunpowder, disguised as a blockade runner, would be sailed straight to the fort and detonated, annihilating the defenders in one deafening blast. Admiral Porter, skeptical but willing, agreed to the gamble. On December the 23rd, the Louisiana crept into position, its hull groaning under the weight of its deadly cargo. The Confederates watched from the ramparts, seeing only what they assumed was a blockade runner in distress. The timer was set, just in case the captain lit a slow-burning fuse as an extra precaution. Then they abandoned ship and waited. 1 hour passed, then another. The detonation had failed. Finally, at 1:40 a.m., fire reached the powder. The night sky erupted in flame, a shockwave rippling across the coastline. The explosion was enormous, deafening, and spectacularly worthless. The fort stood unscathed. The only thing Butler's plan had accomplished was waking up the garrison. Seeing Butler's folly for what it was, Porter resorted to brute force. At noon on Christmas Eve, his warships opened fire. Explosions rocked the fort as cannonballs slammed into its earthen walls. But Butler's men, slow and disorganized, failed to land before nightfall. On Christmas morning, the assault finally began. Another barrage rained down as 2,000 Union soldiers stormed the beaches 3 miles north of the fort. They moved south and straight into hell. Confederate shrapnel tore through the ranks. The ground itself was a death trap, littered with mines that detonated under their boots. A handful of prisoners, a meaningless redoubt taken, and no path forward. Butler, seeing his chance at glory slipping away, did what cowards do. He retreated. His men were ordered back onto the transports and the fleet sailed away. The failure was total. The only good news? Ulysses S. Grant had enough. Butler was relieved of command and sent home in disgrace. Grant did not tolerate failure. If Fort Fisher would not fall to incompetence, it would fall to force. He sent a new commander, Brigadier General Alfred Terry, at the head of 8,000 men. Porter remained with the fleet, ready to finish what he had started. Inside the fort, Colonel William Lamb knew what was coming. His garrison had shrunk to 800 exhausted men, yet his pleas for reinforcements went unanswered. Then on January 12th, Union transports appeared on the horizon. The storm was about to break. Before the sun even touched the horizon, Porter's ironclads thundered to life. They pounded the fort, watching for the telltale flash of Confederate cannons. Every enemy gun that revealed itself was swiftly targeted for oblivion. 9 miles up the coast, Terry's army made landfall. By mid-afternoon, all 8,000 men were ashore, but they weren't advancing yet. First, they turned and dug in, preparing for the inevitable Confederate counterattack. Confederate General Robert Hoke arrived with 6,000 troops from Wilmington, ready to drive Terry's force back into the sea, but one look at the entrenchments convinced him otherwise. Attacking would be suicide. He held his ground and did nothing. Back at Fort Fisher, Porter's fleet unleashed hell. 627 naval guns hammered the fort, blowing apart cannon emplacements, tearing through bunkers, and killing defenders by the dozens. The night was filled with fire, smoke, and the screams of the dying. On January 14th, General W.H.C. Whiting arrived with 750 reinforcements, far too little and far too late. Worse still, he carried grim news. Confederate General Braxton Bragg, in command of the region, was already looking beyond the battle. He had no intention of holding Fort Fisher to the last man. His thoughts were on retreat. Whiting pulled Lamb aside, his voice heavy with resignation. Quote, "Lamb, my boy, I have come to share your fate. You and your garrison are to be sacrificed." End quote. There would be no relief force, no breakout, no escape. Fort Fisher was on its own. On January 14th, another day passed, another relentless bombardment. Confederate gunners tried to fire back, but there was little left to shoot with. Their cannons had been blasted to pieces. Ammunition was running out. Another 100 men were dead. The walls that had once stood defiant were now crumbling under the endless Union onslaught. Dawn broke on January 15th. A small Confederate relief force, 350 men, drifted down the Cape Fear River, slipping past Union positions and into the fort. But they hadn't come to reinforce a stronghold. They had come to join the damned. They arrived just in time for the final battle. Union troops stormed forward, bayonets fixed, ready to carve their way into the fort. Lamb, bloodied, led his men out to meet them. Rifles cracked, bullets cut through the charging ranks, and the first wave was hurled back in a storm of well-aimed Southern musket fire. The Lamb had no way of seeing what was happening beyond the smoke and the chaos. A second force, smaller but deadly, had crept along Cape Fear River's edge, and they found an opening. They swarmed over the walls. 3 Union flags rose above the fort's parapets. Whiting saw it first. He threw the last of his men at the breach. Lamb abandoned the outer fight and rushed back. For a moment, the Confederates regained their ground. The fort held. Then Porter's warships saw the opportunity. The fleet shifted its fire, shells screaming in, detonating in the very center of the melee. Confederate and Union soldiers alike were shredded by the explosions. The walls were collapsing, and so was any chance of victory. A shell burst near Whiting, tearing through his body. Another round struck Lamb, knocking him to the ground, blood pouring from his wounds. Dragged into a bomb-proof shelter, the 2 officers who had fought like lions could do nothing now but listen to the slaughter continue above them. By 8 p.m., the last message came through. cold and final. The northern wall was gone. Union troops were inside. The battle had moved beyond the trenches and parapets. It was now a fight in the dark, hand to hand, bayonets thrusting, rifle butts smashing skulls, men killing and dying by the flickering glow of burning debris. Defiant to the very last, Lamb ordered his men to keep fighting, but by 10 p.m., it was over. Terry's army had flooded inside. The last Confederate holdouts were overrun. The flag of the United States flew over Fort Fisher. A Union soldier stepping over the mangled bodies summed it up best, quote, "If hell is what it is said to be, then the interior of Fort Fisher is a fair comparison," end quote. The ground was soaked in blood. Men lay in heaps where they had fallen, some still grasping their weapons, others moaning for water before death finally took them. Fort Fisher had been erased. 40,000 shells had pounded it into oblivion. 500 Confederate defenders lay dead. Terry had lost 955 men storming the walls. Porter, hammering away with naval guns, had suffered 386 casualties of his own. The price had been steep, but the last gateway of the Confederacy was now gone. The bloodshed, though, didn't end with the battle. That night, exhausted Union soldiers, looking for a place to rest, entered a powder magazine with torches in hand. The explosion that followed killed and maimed 104 men. Victory had come, but at a terrible cost. With Fort Fisher gone, Wilmington fell in February of 1865 without a fight. The last Confederate port was shut. The last hope of the South was buried in the ruins of Fisher. The war would grind on for a few more months, but the outcome was now certain. The Union had broken the Confederacy's back. And in that final, desperate stand on the shores of North Carolina, the last true defenders of the South had fought, bled, and died in the fading light of a lost cause. See, for years, Wilmington had been the Confederacy's last defiant heartbeat, pumping food, weapons, and survival itself into a war already lost in all but name. 12 million pounds of supplies had slipped past the noose, fueling the desperate, the dying, the men who still believed, who still fought, still bled in the mud and the fire of Fort Fisher. They had held out against the inevitable, against a nation too strong, too relentless, too determined to be denied. They had fought until the sky itself burned, until their walls collapsed, until their leaders lay broken and bleeding in the dark. And then, silence. The last port was gone. The last lifeline severed. The blockade complete. No food, no ammunition, no hope. Only the long, slow march to surrender as the American Civil War, the war that had consumed everything, came to its final, crushing end.